And now I'm going to introduce Cherie Santos-Wuest. Cherie is the managing partner at Celadon Venture Partners. She's also a CRE DC board member, and she has extensive experience in investments, private equity funds, and with Tia Cruff, as well as the CT State Pension Fund. And I sent out the bios for both Martha and Cherie prior to the call because I wanted to make sure you all know about the credentials of the folks that we're hearing from today. And Cherie, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce Martha and to take over the program. Over to you, Cherie.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you, Leslie and Claire, our committee chairs for CRE DC, for putting this program together and allowing us to speak. We actually only have one expert here, that would be Martha, and I'm a consumer of her trade and her wisdom. And I thank you all for joining us today. As the program talks about, as COVID-19 vaccine distribution commences across the country, it is now time to turn our attention to the prospects of commercial real estate, its performance and its investment in a post-COVID world. With more institutional monies being poured into real estate by investors who seek yield in a very low bond market environment, how is commercial real estate going to do, and how are real estate investors going to navigate in this world? And so I'm so pleased to have my friend and former TIA CREF colleague Martha Peyton here today to provide us with an up-to-the-minute overview of the U.S. real estate investment markets. And Martha, if you could please describe for us what you've seen as an economist and as well as an institutional investor from your new platform at Aegon.
All right. Thank you very much, Cherie. Thank you, Kathy. It's a pleasure to Zoom with CRE today. I put on makeup for the first time and I don't even remember. So I want to start by saying a few words about U.S. commercial real estate performance in 2020. Overall, performance was a whole lot better than many of us hoped, and a whole lot better than many of us feared it would be. NACRIF total return, which of course we all monitor, was a positive 1.6%. And that's after 1 quarter of negative return in the second quarter, a bare minus 0.1%. So this suggests that the COVID recession might be a replay of the 2001 recession, when total return held up pretty well. In fact, it was 0.7% fourth quarter of 01, and that was the worst quarter of that recession. But it's really too soon to breathe a sigh of relief. The recession really isn't over. Uncertainty about the new world after COVID and uncertainty about the progression of commercial real estate structural drivers is still very much on the table. Now, I participate in a PRIA forecast survey, and the most recent issue of that survey shows a consensus forecast of 3.8% total return in 2021. I think that's a very reasonable expectation, and what it reflects is some recovery in apartments as the new COVID relief bill actually comes to supply checks to people who need them. It reflects continual boom in the industrial sector, and it reflects some settling down in office and in retail, and I'll say more about that later. Kathy, let's look at slide number 1. The recession isn't over. And you see that very clearly in this slide. Oh, I'm sorry, slide number 2. We already did who I am. What you see in this slide is the total of non-agricultural employment in the US, starting with pre-COVID in November 2019. Even after February job additions that totaled a very nice 379,000 and not shown on this chart, we are still down almost 9 million jobs. That's a sign that the recession continues. 9 million jobs. Let's look at slide number 2. Slide number 3. Go ahead, Kathy. Okay, in this slide, what we're looking at is the total number of individuals who are collecting some form of either unemployment compensation, regular or extended, or some form of the special pandemic assistance for those whose incomes were impaired by the virus. And you see that for the week of January 30th, 18 million people were collecting some form of compensation. This data gets updated every week on Thursday when the initial unemployment claims number is released. So when you look at this against the reported unemployment rate, which is just north of 6%, you really see the conclusion that that reported unemployment rate is woefully short of measuring exactly how much distress there is in the US. It's simply not telling the whole story. Now, it's true that GDP is climbing out of the second quarter trough and returning to growth, but that doesn't signify the end of suffering. Recession technically is defined as quarters of negative GDP growth, but that definition is only technical, and it overlooks the fact that we still have an artificial lid on economic activities until we get to herd immunity. Now, that lid is behind the story that you'll see in the next slide. Next slide, Kathy. This is data from NACRF, and what it shows is the quarterly change in net operating income by property sector measured on a year-over-year basis. And what you see is that apartment NOI really took a hit in fourth quarter of 2020. That was the period when the earlier CARES package of income support expired, right? You remember that that tranche of support stopped at the end of July. And that's when we see in the red bar the first significant deterioration in apartment NOI, and much more serious in the fourth quarter. So as we start pumping out new income support, we should see an improvement there, and that very much will contribute to NACRF performance in 2021.
Martha,
Just
if you don't mind my interrupting for a second, for those who are not inculcated in investment management speak, can you tell us who contributes the data to NACRE?
Okay, so NACRIF is a nonprofit association of investment advisors who manage portfolios of US commercial real estate. Their clients are largely tax advantaged pension funds. NACRIF data goes back to 1978. The association and the database were created to satisfy the need for a benchmark. There's all sorts of rules and regulations about how you submit your data to NACRIF, about requirement for quarterly appraisals, and really airtight accounting data on a property by property basis. Those of us in real estate research world live and die by NACRIF data. We get all excited when the quarterly data is released, and we go digging through mountains and mountains of cuts in that data.
Doesn't everybody share her enthusiasm about this?
Yeah, and of course we believe that everybody in the commercial real estate business drops everything on that day, and similarly gets all excited over the NACRIF data release. So
I think would it be safe to say that NACRIF is a measure by which most institutional investors, and somebody actually told me during one of my job interviews that the commercial real estate properties in this country, 85% are owned by institutional investors like pension funds, insurance companies, and public companies like REITs. Would that be safe to say? And they all adhere to and contribute data to NACRE?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure people understood that.
Right, NACRIF measures performance on a time-weighted total return basis, which is based on quarterly appraisals. It also gives us net operating income. And if you dig deeply, it gives us information on operating expenses, on capital expenses, on leasing and tenant improvement expenses. The industry very typically benchmarks itself against performance of the NACRIF index. However, NACRIF is largely a metric for core property performance. That is, properties that are largely stabilized and tenanted. We could have a whole Zoom meeting on difficulties of benchmarking value add and opportunistic strategies, but then I wouldn't get to show you the rest of my slides.
Please show us the rest of your slides.
That's a really good question, Cherie. Okay, so back to industrial net operating income is booming. That will continue in 2021. Office is very interesting because it appears that through 2020, there was certainly a diminution in net operating income, but it didn't go negative. And it's a metric where you can scratch your head and say, wait a minute, we're all working from home. Offices are dark, sublease space has exploded. What's going on here? And what you need to remember is that office space responds to economic challenges with a significant lag, because office leases, as you know, are largely long-term leases. So what we've got now is a period of tremendous uncertainty about how much space will be rolled over by tenants. How will they cope with improving the healthfulness of being in the office? How will they spread people out? And whether their employees will really care about that for very long. So lots of uncertainty there, but it will be resolved and acted upon largely as leases roll. Retail, no surprise there. Retail has really been the sector most beaten up by COVID, right? The virus has transferred demand from retail space to industrial space as we shift our shopping online. But you have to bear in mind that that shift was already happening and has been underway for approaching 20 years now. But the pace of growth in online shopping really expanded tremendously due to COVID. And what surprises me the most is how much grocery shopping shifted online. That would really be the last sector that I had expected to see move to online shopping, because when I buy organic strawberries at $6, I want to make sure that they look good, that there's not, a couple of moldy ones in the bottom of that package. So I'm surprised at how much grocery shopping has moved online. There is uncertainty about how online shopping vis-a-vis in-store shopping will resolve in the quarters ahead. So, when we put this all together, I haven't really seen any forecasts about how much retail space may or may not come back. I think what we are agreed upon is that higher quality retail space, deeper pocketed owners of retail space will do better because they will have the wherewithal to fill vacant space, to respond to what it is that consumers will want, and also because they were in the best position pre-COVID to deal with the evolution of retailing. Office, I think, is more complicated because we've got two forces offsetting each other. On the one hand, we have the expectation that there will be more working from home on a permanent basis. And there's all sorts of surveys out there, but what they appear to be really focusing on is that about 15, maybe a little bit more % of people who can do their jobs remotely wish to work from home full-time and permanently. The rest, the vast majority of us would like to have more flexibility in where we work. Some people would like to have a permanent schedule of I work 3-4 days in the office, I work 1-2 days at home. Others would like just more generalized flexibility to say, my babysitter's sick, I need to work from home. The plumber is coming, I need to work from home. And I mean, I look at that desire for flexibility, and I think that that's something that's going to be difficult for employers to deal with. It's also going to be difficult for individual employees to deal with. I mean, it's fine to say, hey, the babysitter didn't come today. It's 7:30 in the morning, so I'm going to work from home. But did you bring your computer home? Did you bring home the files you were working on? Do you have all you need to work from home? And in the interest of that flexibility, are you going to carry that stuff back and forth with you every day? And maybe that's just an indication of my laziness, but I think that's question.
I had a pretty
So,
big Morgan Stanley gym bag that used to do that, whenever I had to work from home 3 days a week back in the day. If you
yeah,
recall,
oh
we were
yes.
required to work from home a few days a week as TIA consolidated its offices from 3 buildings to one in New York. And we shrunk not only our workforce, but our real estate. It was interesting to go through that back then. And I'm seeing a lot of flexibility as well among other work or office worker peers today.
And there was very mixed reactions to that. I mean, there were people who applauded, yeah, I get to work from home.
I think it had to do with how long your commute was and how bad it was. I mean, mine
Yeah,
was a
but
2-hour
there
commute to
were
Connecticut,
others,
right?
there were others who were very put upon and felt like, they were being thrown out of home.
Well,
So I just saw a message of someone said, yes, I always carry all my stuff with you, with me. Anyway, so, the consensus is that it's about 15% who would prefer to work from home full time. From point of view of employers, there are questions about managing people who work from home, particularly new employees. How do you transmit culture to new employees if you don't see them, if they don't hang around the coffee pot with more
absolutely.
senior employees?
Right.
So there's uncertainty there. There's also uncertainty about how to achieve efficient use of office space, given that you're going to have this amorphous kind of movement of employees working from home, working from the office. And, I'm leaving that to the creativity of office designers. And in the back of my mind, I have these visions of these pods that just get moved around as people are in the office.
It's like hoteling an office space
Yeah,
202, right?
hoteling in the office. I think the other issue compounding how do you use space efficiently is how do you improve the quality of space so that your employees feel safe from contagion. Science tells us that this COVID outbreak will not be the last, that we really have to pay attention to contagion and to various mutations in these viruses going forward. So the question then is improving ventilation, improving natural light, convincing your office occupants that space is being cleaned. I think that that's also a challenge, and it's also going to cost building landlords increased expenses. So these uncertainties affecting retail and office are discouraging transactions. We've got wide bid-ask spreads, making valuations in those sectors murky, and we've got a lot of catastrophizing going on. I think it's human to take these sorts of shocks and push them out. And it reminds me very much, I was in New York after 9/11, and there were very serious predictions that lower Manhattan would never come back.
Come back, right.
And we
Right.
all know that did not happen.
Well, it's the sky is falling syndrome.
Yes,
I
the
suppose.
sky is falling. It's the end of the world. And of course, we tend to muddle through these things.
It's contagious.
So
too.
apartment and industrial are less murky, and they're justifiably sought after by investors. Sheds and beds has become the watchword of appetite for apartment and industrial. But the risk I see here is that industrial is becoming too rich, because consumers will buy less online in time, and there will be a settling down in the need and demand for office space. So we are watching consumer behavior. Let's look at the next slide, Kathy. Okay, the Census Bureau, back in the spring of last year, introduced a pulse survey, P-U-L-S-E. The pulse survey is a weekly survey, and it is attempting to answer questions about consumer attitudes, consumer behavior, along with conditions among small businesses here. So in this slide, what we're showing you is data that it's now a week old. We've got more recent data, but you know, I'm showing you this as an example. What I am tracking is the period to period change in consumer behavior, in consumer expectations. So if you look at the left-hand chart, what I'm highlighting is question of, are you making, or over the past 7 days, have you been making more in-store purchases? Over the past 7 days, have you resumed eating in restaurants? And the pattern of the response is very interesting. If you look at the period around the end of the year in December, right? You see November, December, you see the yellow bar get lower and lower and lower and bottom out January 18. And what that is reflecting is the upsurge in COVID diagnosis as we got into the fourth quarter, right? November, October, that was sort of a lull when people were seeing that the lockdowns had created some control on contagion. And then over the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, there was a lot of socializing that really boosted up contagion. And if you look, that January 18th bar shows you consumers noticed, and fewer resumed eating in restaurants. Similarly, we saw a diminution in in-store purchases from that initial November 9th reading, lower and then stabilized in December. And we've got some uptick now in the first week of February. The Pulse survey has 9 topics.
It was the P number.
Go ahead, Martha. I think somebody unmuted for a minute. Martha's muted now. Could you unmute her, please, Kathy?
Sorry, that was a accidental button push, everyone. There we go. Martha, I think you're good now. I apologize for
Oh,
that.
okay, all right. Employment, food security, health, housing, social security, spending your stimulus check, and transportation. We're on the next slide, Kathy. Right, okay. The other metric that I track is confidence to pay next month's rent. And here you really see the effect of the expiration of the income support. You see that blue line drop November into December. At the end of the year, we did have that $900 million package passed by Congress that resumed the subsidies. And the February increase is a reflection at that point in time that Congress would pass the new package, which indeed it has. If you take a look now at the next slide, this is
Interesting
from
how
the polls.
sensitive, those payments have done to the confidence factor. How sensitive consumers have been to those types of stimulus.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think those of us who can work from home, who are getting our salaries, can become very isolated from the pain that's out there, from the fear that's out there. You see that in particular in rent paying ability, in people who just, had a real hard time thinking about how they were going to pay next month's rent.
Absolutely.
When those support packages were in question. So in this slide, we're looking at small businesses, and they're defined by the Census Bureau as businesses having fewer than 500 employees. So it's really a big chunk of businesses. And they are asked, well, what's been the effect of COVID on your business? And you can see that the majority here have suffered either large or moderate negative effects. At the 30%, 45%, you've got 75% of small businesses. So altogether, even with the resumption of positive GDP growth and with some nice improvement in job numbers in February, and some success in distributing the COVID vaccine, I think we're getting close to 10% of the population has been fully vaccinated at this point. The key question going forward, key question for how we climb out of this recession is how much of the economy has been destroyed. I mean, restaurants that have closed shop, that are out of business, small businesses that have dismantled, they're not coming back. And what needs to happen going forward to truly translate into recovery is that the space of reviving businesses, the space of creating new businesses has to take up the slack that the virus has created. It remains to be seen how quickly that will happen. If we get a sizable infrastructure bill that will help to boost creation of new businesses. But I also think there's hope in the creativity of the American economy and in new businesses around new ideas that come out of wisdom that we've accumulated dealing with this COVID shock, about cleanliness, about the arrangement of space, about ventilation, about contagion, about personal protective gear, about just-in-time inventories. I mean, there are lots and lots of lessons to be learned from the experience of the last year. And hopefully creative entrepreneurs will build new businesses around them. And we're going to have questions now, Cherie. Except I can't hear you.
Unmute me there.
Okay.
That sounds fine. Oh, thanks, Martha. That was a terrific overview. And you've shown a lot of very good data as succinctly as you could. I know that there's a lot behind all that data you've shared with us, but you've shown how the pandemic has indeed thrown a kink into the trajectory of a lot of real estate sectors and properties across markets. Let's drill down a little bit, because not all markets are equal, as you know. If we look at the greatest impacts, where have they been? So you have done a very good job of breaking down commercial real estate by sector in the 4 basic food groups: multifamily, industrial, office, and retail. But in speaking with other institutional investors in the markets, I'm hearing a great deal of interest in sub-asset sectors like senior housing, hotels, because in a recovery, hotels, and in particular, not conference hotels or convention hotels, but limited service hotels. I know I can't wait to get traveling again, going to hotels, staying in hotels after the vaccine. And things like data centers, life science, student housing. Who are the winners and losers in this new post-COVID economy?
Looking at other sectors, hotels, I think, is on the top of the list of interesting sectors, because the stress has been so very extreme. I think that we're seeing opportunities to convert hotels, to convert less successful, less centrally located hotels into things like affordable housing and emergency housing for the homeless. I know here in California, some municipalities have rented out entire hotels to house homeless people as a way of putting a lid on contagion. I think that there will be a lot of churning in the hotel sector. And again, those that survive as hotels will be those that have been more successful. The question, I think, is separating out the leisure market from the business market, and the question of whether business travel will permanently remain depressed, because we're all just so thrilled with Zoom meetings. And I personally,
not all of us, but
I personally think that business travel will most certainly return, because doing business is about more than exchanging information, more than exchanging slide decks. It's about ordering a martini and sitting and talking to your potential customer about their homes and their kids and their businesses, and really getting a feel for who are these people. I think that we as a social species, I mean, this isn't about what's happened the last year or two. This is about who we are as human beings. So,
well, you know, I worked for somebody once who was a banker who made a comment about real estate people. He said, you know, I understand everybody likes to meet and greet, but real estate people in particular like to just knosh. I think we had something called the Chardonnay Shuffle assigned to Alice Connell, if you remember. I think she invented the
yeah,
term.
I think it is the worst of catastrophizing to say business travel is dead. And it
Right.
also happened after 9/11, right? If you recall, I mean, we were never going to get on airplanes again.
On the other hand, I spoke to a consultant in Cleveland who said he was able to cover not only meetings on the East and the West Coast without having to get onto Southwest Airlines, but also in London. He's actually able to go to LP meetings because he did, you know, the business travel was somehow cut out. So I think you're right. I think people are ready to travel, but they've probably also realized how beneficial less travel could be.
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, I think it remains to be seen how much comes back, but I think, you know, calling the end to business travel is just catastrophizing.
No, I can't wait to see my crew friends.
Yeah.
I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up, though, because we do have to talk about this. There has been a palpable impact on urban centers. New York City is among some of the earliest virus hot zones, right? But certainly not the last. And we're talking about how Zoom, can we talk about how Zoom and the fear of density and future pandemics will have major and permanent impact on cities, some people say.
Yeah.
And as people flee to the suburbs. Do you actually think that'll pan out?
Okay, let me first though say a few words on other sectors, and then we can talk a little bit about density.
Sorry.
I think the sector that is of most concern is senior housing, and I think that my concern there is not so much about the impact of COVID as about the effect of overbuilding in that sector and building prematurely to the aging of the baby boom. I think that that sector really needs to come to terms with balancing supply and demand. Data centers are technology dependent, and I think investors in data centers are really behooved to understand where that technology is going in the future, because you know, we really don't know if the world of servers will continue long term. I think that 5G will offer investment opportunities because of the requirements for how 5G is transmitted. But that too is technology dependent, and you know, requires that investors understand what that's about. Let's go to density now. We have been seeing a shift towards stronger demand for suburban apartments, suburban office versus really dense CBD locations. In certain cities, particularly New York and San Francisco, where CBD apartments are very expensive and very cramped. We are seeing tenants moving to suburban rentals with more space, because working from home out of a one-bedroom apartment when you've got a little kid is crazy making. So that's totally understandable.
Or
However,
sitting on your bed in New York with your files spread out in front of you, which has actually happened. I was talking to one of our accountants. Remember when we had to work from home, it's not always the most optimum way
yeah,
to work
yeah.
from home.
So, you know, my grown daughters, when we chat on FaceTime, they joke about, can you imagine if we were 10 again and you were working from home? No, I cannot imagine. But in any case, the de-densification in response to an appetite for more space is very, very understandable. However, there is the operation of pricing that is very much underway right now. Interesting statistic is that New York City rentals improved in the last couple of months because rents went down. So what I think will happen over the months ahead will be the market finding a new equilibrium. I mean, I am an economist after all. Prices will adjust to find that new equilibrium between CBD rentals, suburban rentals, more dense space, less dense space, office as well, CBD office versus suburban office. A new equilibrium at new pricing will be established, but it won't be immediately. The other element that's really important is public transportation. In central cities that are dependent on public transportation, you have the added concern of safety and safety from contagion. Are you ready to ride the subway again in New York? Are you ready to ride the BART again? I am told that in London, traffic is just unbearable because people are staying away from the tubes, from public transportation. I think that resumption of confidence in getting on the subway will occur after we see the numbers of new cases really drop down to almost imperceptible. So there's lots of elements at play here. But again, we've got to remember that those CBDs, New York, San Francisco, Chicago,
We're
they
talking
are,
about central business districts, not pot here, just so everybody.
yeah, I mean, they are there because there has been very long live demand for people to live and work in those kinds of locations. That doesn't disappear after, you know, this kind of stress. I mean, we're not, you know, I'm a great student of history, and I'm remembering the stories of, you know, feudalism where, you know, we would be sitting at our kitchen tables making lace. We're not going back to
Not
that.
happening, not happening. You know, by the way, you know, my husband who came home from New York on March the 13th a year ago and hasn't gone back since, has been on phone calls both in London and Zoom, both in London and New York. And New York's having the same issues he described with traffic because Metro North is not deemed to be safe yet, so to speak. But The pandemic recedes with the vaccine, and as we reach more and more herd immunity, I've heard the number of up to 40% with both post-COVID people who've had COVID and people who've had the vaccine. What do you see? Is there any hangover effect that you see on the real estate markets? What's the largest hangover?
Say that again, Cherie.
What is the largest hangover effect that you see on the real estate markets after COVID?
I think that the most important long-term effect is a reversal of the densification of office space. Cherie mentioned our experience at TIAA, and in recent years,
we were ahead of our time.
Yeah, we were ahead of our time. They moved toward extremely dense arrangement of people. No more cubes, no more offices. We were
we
all
shared offices on different days. I remember doing that with Amy O'Brien.
Right. It became bench space. And, I used to joke, bench space is something that came out of tech world. And it came out of tech world because you had young people with their earphones on, working on their computers, probably with their dog sitting under their chair. And, 2 feet away from the person on either side. And I used to joke that, in 200-300 years, human beings would lose their capacity to speak because that generation didn't speak. They IM'd, but they didn't speak. And the way you could accommodate working in that sort of arrangement was you do not speak, you do not make phone calls. And what I think businesses discovered was that there was need to have telephone booths so that people could make phone calls, so that they could speak.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
there's the private
case,
and the public space that needs to be managed. Right. And
so
I think you're right.
Surveys, more recently, and pre-COVID, showed that sort of densified space really wasn't making people happy, that it was not meeting their needs, and that it was impairing communication across colleagues. And I think that occurred as that sort of arrangement spread from tech world into the larger world of office users, where people work in a different way, where it's not about, I sit at my machine and I code all day. And oh, by the way, I'm not a very social communicative person to begin with. So
I think the introverts have felt it less than some of us have. Certainly.
Yeah, I think that that will be a long-lived result, because now, in the interest of addressing contagion fear, people simply won't sit on top of each other. They won't sit 2 feet apart, given the sensitivity that's coming out of COVID.
I think you're right. It'll be interesting to watch. And I'm very mindful of the fact that we have 3 minutes left. I'd like to open the floor up to any questions. The audience has been largely silent on Q&A, but if you would, if you'd like to type in your question, or Kathy, perhaps you can unmute the audience. I'm sure there's loads of questions there.
So I know Leslie has also been monitoring the chat. I think that we had some comments about this. but not specific questions. And in terms of unmuting, rather than unmuting the audience, what I would just offer is that if you do have a question you'd like to raise, unmute yourself and ask it, or type it into the chat because we are watching.
Kathy Conway, Crew, Austin. I noticed that you said other places are using hotels for homeless, and Austin's doing that as well. I'd be interested in knowing how many people on the chat, how many of their cities are doing that. I don't know where everybody's from, but.
I'm in DC, but my husband works out of New York. And there have been a couple of large hotels that have been converted to, I have friends in New York as well, that have been converted to house the homeless. There have been some, mixed results on that, as I understand. I understand crime rates are up in certain areas of Midtown. That's been the experience anecdotally that we've heard. What's been your experience in Austin?
Well, they've just started buying them and haven't really put anybody into them yet. They're trying to create almost like a community, but with buying a hotel and putting people into it, then you're policing the people, because you got to get all types of people in there, and they're trying to create like a health area for people that may have mental issues as well as just health care issue. And I'm afraid we're going to make it so nice for them that we're going to have a lot more people coming here for it.
For what it's worth, I have a client in California in the Bay Area who has gotten in. He's been a multifamily person for years. He's been purchasing broken hotels, and these are, motels mostly, and turning them into not SRO, single room occupancy type units, but micro units. And there's a certain threshold. It's what I call workforce, where they would have people who could afford $500, $600 a month rents, which is very low for the Bay Area, some of you may know. And he's finding a lot of uptake on this. Many of the tenants are women of color, but who are working 2 or 3 jobs, for what it's worth. So it's something to keep an eye on.
I do think it gives them dignity and gives them a place to take a shower. So if they want to go to work, they can, because you got to have, you got to have some basic needs taken care of. I just wondered how they were working across the country. And I know Seattle and Bezos bought an office building and basically created like a health center and space for people there. So it's obviously a bigger crisis across the country than we know.
I agree. You're right.
So we did have another question. It's great. Some folks are putting comments about other cities and what they're doing in the chat on this hotel question. We did have another question, which was about the implications associated with undoing the extreme density of office space that was only recently implemented. Our questioner worked for a large financial services organization, and they implemented this bench style seating exclusively over the past 2 years, and there are big costs associated with reversing this.
Oh no.
Oh, I saw one of your supporters is the Gensler Company, and they are right there in the middle of this. How do we renovate space to deal with these issues?
A lot more work for architects out there.
Yeah, I mean, there are absolutely costs in doing this, even if it's simply spreading people out. And I think that, again, as we invest in office properties, we've got to recognize that there will be CapEx expenses associated with dealing with this new sensitivity. In fact, the opportunity may be among value add types of office properties where you're going to renovate anyway. So, you may as well renovate it to what will eventually become the new standard for both, how you arrange the space and windows and ventilation, etc. Existing space, that is, a big question. And some of you may be consultants who are working on this, but again, I think that is a new area of business. How do you do it in the most cost efficient way?
Yes. So I'm sensitive to the time. It's 1:33. We scheduled ourselves to end at 1:30. We have some really terrific comments on this concept in the chat as well. And I want to thank you, Martha, and you, Cherie, for getting together on this. As you can see, there is a lot of interest. We all want to try to figure out what's coming next. So we so appreciate your time giving it to us so that we can know what you know and learn along with you. Thank you for that. And this meeting has been recorded. The recorded session will be sent out to all of the registered participants after the fact so that you can come back to it again and refer to it if you need to.
Thank you, Martha.
Well, thank you all very much.
CDC.
Looking at the comments, I see that you were a great audience.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
and thank you, Cherie.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a
Enjoy the rest of
terrific
your day.
and a
Thank
week.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.